Wilma Derksen is a sought-after speaker and consultant on the topics of victimization and criminal justice. Her wisdom is hard-won. I have wanted to meet her forever. In the mid-1980s, Wilma's daughter, Candace, was murdered, and their family's response to this tragedy created enormous conversation, admiration, and curiosity about how we live with the things we can't change. And you will soon see why. She wrote about her story in her book, The Way of Letting Go. She also just finished her memoir, so this feels like the absolute perfect time to talk to her. Wilma, at last. Here you are. It's so good to finally meet you.
It's good to be here. Thanks.
I knew about you growing up because I grew up in Winnipeg.
Right. Okay. Yes.
And then the first time I realized, oh yeah, I could go talk to you was Malcolm Gladwell had said, we were talking about why bother being a person of faith at all. And he said, well, I actually have a very good reason. And her name is Wilma.
I know. I met him, yes.
I really liked the idea that meeting a person, him meeting you, could be like an argument. And I thought, oh my gosh, I can't wait to meet you.
Oh, he did ask very good questions.
So I wonder then if we could start with like young mom, early family Wilma. Who were you then? And what were your big hopes?
Well, Cliff was an artist. We met as an artist and writer at Bible school, right? And so that was who I was. We were going to have this wonderful life of just not quite fit the box, right? Yeah. We were going to be creatives and we were going to have fun. Then we had these 3 children, Candace, Odie, and Cyrus, and they were kind of surprises. And I had to be practical, so I went into journalism, and
wow.
And it was just, we loved being together.
Yeah.
We had such fun as a family.
Oh.
And it was great.
I was very young when I heard that tragedy had interrupted and absolutely thrown your family into a tailspin. And so much, I imagine you went from a life that seemed entirely perfectly predictable and average.
Totally.
To one that was just like completely torn open.
Yes, it was, it all started with that one day. It was just totally different. I got up in the morning. It was going to be a normal day. I had some deadlines that I had to reach. Candace called me from school and wanted a ride home. And I just said I had a deadline. And she, I often picked her up on Friday afternoons.
Yeah.
And I asked her if she'd walk home, and she was cheery. She was wonderful. So I thought I was in good. We were all in good spaces, and she could walk home, and then we could start the evening. And then she didn't come home from school. It was just something. It totally disrupted everything in our lives. And then we went and I started to call her friends. I started to call I panicked totally because I knew that Candace was the type of person that loved people. She just loved people. And her best friend was coming in the next day from Gimli. And so I knew there was nothing going to keep her away from home that day. So I just panicked. And that just sparked the hunt, the search for 7 weeks, yeah.
Your, kindness toward a process of investigation, which is really brutal. Even just being investigated is so deeply unfair.
Well, we called the police that night, and we expected them to take us seriously and look for Candace because we were in such a panic. And they just asked us about ourselves, and they asked us what we were doing. Cliff said he was a camp director and had been a pastor, and we were pulling out all the good stuff about ourselves and trying to convince them, that we were a good family, that they needed to look for Candace. And they took everything the wrong way. They says, oh, you're religious? Maybe Candace was running away from religious parents, and maybe she was a runaway. And so they didn't really accept anything. The only card that we had to pull from was that Candace was expecting her best friend the next day, and that Candace was a people person. And so we played that over and over again. So finally they put it on citywide alert. But that was just the first shock that there was there's going to be some pushback. And that was really tough at that moment. And then that night was just horrible, and then we got the friends to come in, and they were wonderful in helping us and supporting us. And then and they too knew that Candace and Heidi, her best friend, were just Jonathan and David kind of relationship. So they knew that that her disappearing on that day was a huge alert for everyone involved. Yeah.
Is it that like slow, terrible, surreal quality to it, that whole stretch of time?
Oh, it was just, well, we were just so absorbed in it, in such a panic. Like, I don't think I realized till 10 o'clock that night that the kids hadn't eaten anything. We were just, and then they were whimpering, and I thought, oh my word. And just the disruption, and then the other surreal.
Yeah.
Where was Candace? Who could possibly have taken it? And I guess it was my worst worry, because Candace was a 13-year-old that just a child, really, that had turned into a woman overnight, and she was still a child, innocent of how she presented herself. But yet I knew that she was very appealing. I saw the men look at her when she was in a restaurant. And she had that flush of innocence and charm, and so I had that sick feeling almost immediately.
Yes.
Almost immediately, that somebody had taken her, and that had been attracted to her and had been stalking her or something. And then just the pain of that, and then the imagination of the horror of that, right?
Yes.
And all of that came just that night. And of course I pled with God, just take care of Candace, and all of that. Just bargained everything possible, right? Yeah. And then just stayed up, and just sat at the window looking out. And the whole city goes to sleep, right? And it was no longer possible for me to do any work on it, or call anybody. And just the nightmare started.
Is one of the hardest things about those early days trying to figure out if there's anything you can do, and then having to live with the fact that most of the time there's just nothing to do?
I think that was the shock, that there was absolutely nothing to do. We couldn't call anybody. I'd called everybody possible. And then we did all the, followed every lead possible. Yeah. And then just to sit there and think that my daughter could be in pain, could be in a hostage, could be being raped, and I can absolutely do nothing.
Yeah.
Just horrible.
Yeah. I wish there was a bit, like a different word for the pain you experience through the pain of your child. And that desire so much to like reabsorb it into your own body. Like,
totally. I would rather have been there for it. Like, take me, dude. I'll go through it. Just leave. And Candace was the type of child that she was very sensitive. So whenever even my parents would say, my goodness, she's sensitive. Whenever she'd hurt herself, we'd all know about it. So to imagine her, or try not to imagine her in pain, was just overwhelming. Just totally. I can't describe the feelings of just, I could feel the pain.
Yeah.
In fact, I got cold. All of a sudden, and she was in the shack, and she was actually dying of hypothermia, and I could feel the cold. Oh. So it was around 4 o'clock at night that I was just shivering. I was just cold, and I couldn't understand. Cliff had gone to bed because I don't think he could feel it like I did. Uh-huh. And he had hope, and I didn't. And so I went to bed.
And you didn't?
I didn't. Oh. I kind of knew.
There was like a knowing.
Kind of knew. Yeah, I kind of knew. And there is a connection. There is a connection. Yeah. So I was shivering, so I went to bed. And then all of a sudden I realized that the wind in the house had stopped. I didn't know there was a wind. And I'm going to cry. And that's when I realized there was a wind there. I felt it. Like you said, there was a connection. And then I says, Candace, are you okay? And she says, yes, Mom. And I knew she was in heaven.
Oh.
I mean, didn't know for sure.
Yeah.
We never know for sure. But there's a part of me that felt that it was over. And I think that was God-given for me, because I don't know if I could have lasted not knowing. So thinking of her in heaven was just beautiful, then, rather than thinking of her in any other kind of situation, uncontrolled and under that kind of assault.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Tough stuff.
Oh.
Even now we just cry. Yeah.
Well, it's impossible. It's just impossible.
Yeah, it's impossible to go through something like that.
Yes. Yeah.
And not feel it.
That season of not knowing, how long was that?
That was 7 weeks. And that turned out to be one of the biggest person hunts in Winnipeg. I think that we had a strong Mennonite community here that knew Candace and knew us and just kicked into action. And it was beautiful the way they looked after us and looked after, my tears. They looked after us and they looked for her, and that was so satisfying just to see everybody kick in like that. And then her body was found on January the 17th, 7 weeks after. And I'll never forget the day when we went to identify her body and then realized the horror of that. And her body had been found in a shack not that far from our place. Her hands and feet had been tied, and she had died of exposure that night. So somebody had taken her, and it looked like a stranger abduction and maybe a homeless person. And so we went home, and the reporters were there, and we said, "Can we have a few days?" And the police were there and investigating, and then our friends came. All of them just piled into our house, and it was odd because we had been physically looking for her, and wrapped up in that search. So there was a kind of celebration that we had found what we were looking for. That relief. We had found her. Wow, we had found her. But then the horror of the murder and the horror of her death, and then the awful realization that she would never be home again, and just the grief setting in. It was up and down and around and about and chaotic.
Yes.
And people were saying all kinds of things, and somebody brought in a cherry pie, warm cherry pie, and all the food came in, right? Because everybody wanted to comfort us. So we had lots of food, and nobody wanted to eat. But something very significant happened that day. Around 10 o'clock, everybody left, and they left us with one couple to look after us with the cherry pie. And we were having it at the kitchen table when there was a knock on the door. And there was a man there. We didn't quite recognize him. He wasn't one of our friends. He was dressed in black. And he said, "I've come to tell you what to expect now." And he was the parent of a murdered child.
That's foreboding.
I know. And he was like a prophet of doom. And he really was. It was a question we wanted to know. We were open to everything at that moment. And so we invited him to the kitchen table. And there for 2 hours, he told us exactly what to expect. He actually was a kind of show and tell. He brought out all the pills that he was taking now, and he lined them up on the table. And he said that my health is gone. He said my relationships with my family are gone. And he kind of insinuated that him and his wife weren't doing that well. He said, "I can't work. I can't concentrate." And then he pulled out all the books from the trial that he'd been at. He'd been 2 years. It'd been a 2-year trial. And he looked absolutely horrific. And he said, "This is what to expect." And then he said, "I've even lost the memory of my daughter."
Even the memory of her.
So that was deep-seated trauma, right? And we didn't even have the word trauma at that point. We didn't know what it was. So when he left after 2 hours, we went up to bed. And Cliff and I were in shock and just traumatized. And then when we got ready for bed, we were standing beside our bed. Both of us could not get into bed. And this is common because the bed represents intimacy, it represents safety, it represents everything like that. It represents turning off your mind. It represents all the fears and everything. So we couldn't get into bed. It was as if there was a presence on the bed. And in hindsight, it was as if the man had left all his trauma and put it on our bed. And now we were supposed to, and we didn't have any other, because we had guests and everything was full. We didn't have anywhere to go. And then Cliff and I said we both said almost simultaneously, "Let's forgive."
Let's forgive.
Let's forgive. We will forgive. Both of us at the same time.
Wow.
And then the presence left. And then we got into bed. Now that seems just weird, doesn't it? I still think back on that, and Cliff and I talked about, at first we couldn't even talk about it because we couldn't deal with it, right? And then we slept because we were tired and exhausted, and then the next day we went into organizing everything, and then they wanted us to talk to the reporters, so our friends actually organized a press conference for us, and so we wanted to invite everybody to Candace's funeral because we were still so grateful for everything they'd done. The 7 weeks had been a nightmare, an absolute nightmare. But it was the support of the people that was absolutely encouraging and thrilling for us. I don't know. It just was so much love.
Thank you for looking for her. Thank you for
It was
caring.
love, right? It was love, and we were living off of that love. We were living off of that love. So we invited everybody, and then all the lights went down, and we were finished our thanking and everything, and we were now going to disappear. And then one of the reporters says, "And what about the murderer?" And we hadn't thought of the murderer. Yeah. We had been so involved with everything that had been happening. So then both Cliff and I said, "Oh, we're going to forgive." It had worked one time. So we're going to just forgive. Yeah. Just leave us. We're going to forgive. It worked one time. We're going to do it again. No, I'm not sure how we're going to do it. Well, the next day, it went public. And I'm a journalist, right? I know that a newspaper story is supposed to be about murder. The murder is everything, right? Yeah. This is the murder story. Well, our story was about our forgiveness choice. Yeah. And that was a rude awakening when it was misinterpreted. People thought we were, and then they did an analysis for us through the paper discussions. There were articles about us of what did forgiveness mean, and the upshot was that we were going to condoned murder. That was the upshot, that we were forgiving murder. Come on. And we weren't even there. We didn't know who did it. It was a way of getting trauma. It was a way of getting, it had worked once, and so we thought it was going to work. We just used it as a knee-jerk reaction to everything after that.
We saw that terrible man. I'm sure you're like, well, it can't be that. It can't be that.
Yeah.
So it's got to be something lovelier somehow than this, like, hollowed out man that we saw in front of us.
Yeah, exactly. That's what we were choosing.
It reminds me of Beth Moore had this nice phrase that I thought of sometimes about a really true thing that you've partly paid for, but like life, but life exacts this very long toll. And she said, anyway, we were talking about like what the lovely thing is, but she goes, "Oh, it's young fruit." And I thought that was a really good description of like the perfect right thing, like the desire to forgive.
Yes.
And then also a truth you have to keep living with.
Exactly.
And somehow aspiring to over and over again.
I don't think we understood any of it at that point. I think, it was just a choice that we had that we had dealt with a lot of the other things that had happened in our lives, like the childhood wounds that Cliff had experienced and the childhood wounds I had experienced. We had sort of forgiven, but we had no idea what it was like on this level.
Wow. What were some of in those newspaper articles, what were some of the immediate like caricatures or like misunderstandings of what forgiveness meant?
Well, mainly that we were forgiving the murder. We were forgiving the murderer and the murder, and that we were somehow condoning murder. And that.
So there's no framework for justice if you forgive someone?
Mm-hmm. Which is really a shock to us. Then we actually went and joined a group called Parents of Murdered Children. Yeah. And they asked me if I would wanted to join them, and I said yes, I would love to, because there's a craziness that happened, and after murder, I wanted to see what this was all about. This crazy thinking that was happening to me, so we got, and then they said they invited me to come, and then when I said yes, then they said just a minute, and they went back and reevaluated their invitation, and I was really surprised, and then they said, well, you have to lose the word forgiveness. So I thought about it for a while, and I thought I understood that. So I said, I'll lose the word forgiveness if you'll let me come. And so I stayed with them for 7 years, and I never used the word forgiveness.
Wow. I just find it so horrifying. And I've had versions of this in my own life where the more you suffer, the more a debate is sort of placed on your shoulders. Yes. Because you then are a problem to be solved in the good parts and the bad parts. Yeah. And it sounds like some of the great hopes that we have for ourselves, that we can have grace in the middle of it, just was like intolerable to some people.
I think the first reaction is sometimes to something horrific is to diminish it with the forgiveness language, right?
Yeah.
And it came at us quite a bit. And I remember one woman said, you know, I know that you're forgiving. You've been saying you're forgiving, but what would it really take for there to be justice? Where would there be equity? And so I thought, okay, I'm going to go there. I'm going to go to my broken mother's heart. And I said it wouldn't be enough for that man to die. So I didn't realize I didn't believe in I believed in capital punishment. I said because he'd be dying for something he did. Candace was innocent, so there would be no equity there. So I looked for justice. What would satisfy me?
Yeah.
And I said 10 child murderers would have to die. I multiplied it by 10, right?
Yeah.
And that wasn't even enough. I didn't feel good after that. And then I said, and I would have to pull the trigger. And I pulled it 10 times, and it was delicious. It wasn't satisfying, but it was delicious.
Yeah.
And then I realized the enormity, right?
Yes.
The enormity of the questions and of the pain. And that we can't gloss over it. Forgiveness isn't, the real true forgiveness isn't glossing over it. Mm-hmm. The true forgiveness path is recognizing it and feeling it and going through the process of it. Yeah. But the glossing over, the fool's forgiveness is what I call it. Yeah. Just doesn't help at all.
You had years to think about how you wanted to, well, how you were engaging in forgiveness at the same time as you were engaging in a seemingly like endlessly unfolding criminal process.
I think I wouldn't be able to told you at that point what was going on, but I think that first of all, I would say that there are categories, and the first part is the body. It was very physical, and I remember how I had to forgive myself. You know, I had to forgive myself for being a mother, right? And that was the anniversary of the day that Candace disappeared. I was going to do something fun, but I couldn't. I had to work, and so I washed down the walls of the hallway. Yeah. Stupid thing to do because I hate washing walls.
Yeah, totally.
And then I came downstairs, and then I came down to the landing, and there was a place where Candace used to hang onto the board and swing down onto the main floor. And so there were her fingerprints. And I looked up and I saw the fingerprints, and it happened about the same time of the day that Candace called me. And that just hit me like a ton of bricks. Oh. If I had chosen differently, if I had been on top of my game and picked her up, none of this would have happened. It was my, procrastination of writing that had caused all of this. Oh, it was just horrible. And, I think that has to be the first thing that has to happen is the bodily needs. We physically have to forgive ourselves for being human and not being the perfect person.
Yeah.
And I know that this has been a thing in with all the parents of murdered children. We had conferences. We called it the F word conference, and we couldn't move. We couldn't move them. None of them. And finally, one of the men says, "I know what's the problem with you. You have to forgive yourself." Oh. And he just laid it out for them, and they did, and that changed the conference. So it's not about forgiving somebody else at first.
Yeah,
it's really about resolving it with yourself and forgiving, and that's the power of forgiveness. Is that we're not perfect. We can't fail. And we're still lovable even if we fail. Yeah. That's the power of the message of forgiveness. And then came the trial, right? 22 years later after it all had happened. And we were kind of moving on. Our children were older.
Yeah, right.
And then they arrested a suspect.
That must have been so shocking.
It was so shocking. And I was so scared because I had watched other people go through the system. Mm-hmm. And I had parents of murdered children come to our group, and they had been doing very well. And then they went through the system, and they came out of the system angrier than ever. And we could not comfort them. We could not comfort them after a trial system. Oh. And then I was scared of it, and was almost more scared than even finding him. And it was horrible. Because, here, just to give you an example, you walk into a courtroom, and, at Walmart and everywhere, you're greeted. You're recognized. Yeah. You're respected. Walked into the courtroom, and everybody else was greeted. The defense, the lawyer, even the accused, the jury, everybody was recognized. No word. I was a parent of a murdered child. I was the mother. Not seen, not heard, not diminished, totally. And the wound of that, to be so insulted in that level, not even to be greeted.
Yeah.
And it was that kind of thinking throughout. And it was just the most unfriendly place ever. And yet everything was at stake. And then having him in the courtroom, and then seeing all of Candace's stuff, and then realizing what had happened that day, and going through that horror, and oh, it was just ugly, just ugly.
Yeah.
Like it was just it was just horrible. And then it was a decade of that.
A decade.
A whole decade of that. It went from the first trial to the preliminary first trial appeal to Manitoba appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada. We went to Ottawa, and then right into another trial. And then he was acquitted.
Oh, come on.
After we were convinced.
Oh.
He was acquitted. And now he's suing the Manitoba legal system for $8.5 million for wrongful conviction. So it's not over. It was in the papers the other day. Candace's picture's still in the papers.
Oh.
So there's always this moment of, oh, it's not over. And Candace, and I remember Cliff, how horrified he was to see his face next to hers in the paper. You know, how even the smallest little thing can just grab your heart and just say, this was not meant to be. She was so beautiful. And why is she in this kind of situation? And it was just, yeah, so there's also the justice-making process that has to be dealt with, the due process has to be dealt with, and realizing that we need to. All of it was good. To find the truth of what happened was really good for all of us. But it's never going to be satisfying. Uh-huh. And that's where we have to forgive. We have to forgive everybody again.
Again.
Yeah.
We have this really beautiful community that everything happens. And one common feature is we just find ourselves in a chapter of life dealing with things we didn't understand and wouldn't have chosen.
Yeah.
And then somehow have to live with it in a new season.
I know. And I just remember my kids were older during the decade of the legal system, and I was so worried.
Yeah.
Like I knew what trauma could do to us as parents. Odia was 9 and Cyrus was 2 at the time that Candace disappeared. And Odia, to get through her grief, she crocheted 490 tears to get through her grief.
That's so beautiful.
Isn't it beautiful? And then she put in installation art, and then we just cried. 4 years of that. So this is the kind of thing to watch your children go through the horror of it. And then 2-year-old Cyrus, I was really worried about him. And he's a mind person. I went into a restorative justice conference one time, and he wanted to stay with me. So he listened to the whole restorative justice conference with me at the table. And they were all presenting doctorates. And then at the end, he was 16 years old at this time. He says, Mom, how do I get my doctorate? And I said, well, you have to get your marks up. And then he said, and if I was a doctor, what should I be? What kind of a doctorate should I be? And I said, psychologist, because I wanted to be a psychologist.
Nice.
You know what? He did. So here we were being devastated as a family, but I think it also made us as well, because we chose to forgive. We chose that every time when it really got tough. This is at the guidance of my son. He said, we have to make this courtroom into a sanctuary. So we would take off our shoes whenever we got tough. So every once in a while, I'd look over, his feet were bare, and Odie's feet were bare, and I knew that they were going through a tough time, but we were putting ourselves in a sanctuary.
Oh, that's really beautiful.
Yeah, we had to survive. We had to survive this torture of something we'd never would have expected.
No.
And to see my other children just survive like that, it tore my heart apart that they had to go through it. You know?
Yeah.
That there was no way that we had caused any of this, and just to have to watch them struggle with it, and know that I couldn't do very much about it, just tore my heart apart.
And then it was going to keep changing you all. Just keep changing you.
Keep changing us.
Wow.
And it hasn't left us. It's part of our story.
Yeah.
And how do we make it good?
Right.
Forgiveness means, first of all, you have to let go of the fear and the trauma of the body, and then you have to find forgiveness is about going through the due process, and then forgiveness is about the heart. You know, how do we deal with criminals? How do we deal with a murderer? I remember the restorative justice put on a conference, and they wanted me to speak as for the victims, and then they wanted me to go to the gymnasium after, where I was going to listen to an offender, you know. And this is part of the restorative justice, where we have the two stories, and we bring the two stories together in a kind of forgiving process. And this man got up behind the podium and he says, "My name is Rennie DeRoche." And he says, "I was once the most wanted man in Canada. My priest told me, my mother, that I would either be the best criminal or the best prime minister. And I chose to be the best criminal, and I was the best." This is what he was telling his kids, you know, these students. And then he said he changed because he loved his children. Well, he didn't even have a Damascus spiritual experience. It was just to children, right? So I didn't trust him. To me, that whole thing, he glorified crime. I was so mad. I was so furious. So then I invited him out for dinner, for breakfast. And he was French Canadian. I was Mennonite, and I was a Christian. He was the most wanted man in Canada. And he said he'd changed. So I put him through a grill. I interviewed him. I thought, I'm not going to let you talk to another crowd unless I know you've changed. And he convinced me. And then we started to work together. I still talk. He still calls me. So, but I had to go through that, you know, and I met it, and then he also, he says, I kept asking him all these questions about criminals, right? I wanted to know about the man who'd killed my daughter. And he finally says, "I can't answer your questions. I'm going to introduce you to lifers." So he introduced me to lifers. So then I put them in through the grill. I'm a journalist, right? So I put them through the grill, and then they dissolved into people. I dissolved them into people, and they were human beings. And they said, "Yes, we're sorry we did it, but we thought we had to kill. At that moment, we had to kill, and now we're sorry." And so we went through the whole process, all over and over again. And there's 10 lifers in the room. A real kind of enlightenment for me that we can't do away with anybody. Yeah. Everybody's important. We can't just cancel them out. We can't just throw them into dungeons. We have to study them. We have to make places for them, and we have to learn better how to love people, especially our children. Because all of this cruelty in this world, we just lose the ability to love. And yeah, it's love that redeems. And forgiveness is all about love. And so by forgiving, we can at least resist that cruelty.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we don't have to perpetuate it. We can stop it with forgiveness and love.
Yeah. Man.
Right.
Wilma, I love listening to you, love other people. This has been a great joy to think with you, to read you, to have like lived alongside your story for this long. It has been an enormous privilege to see you in real life. Thank you so much for doing this with me.
Well, thank you for having me. This is wonderful.